So with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Jeremy Marshall, Bob Parmenter, Stephen Del Favero, and Gabe Kohler. Jeremy was the Southwest Jemez CFLRP Implementation Coordinator from 2012 to 2016 and has worked on many landscape collaboratives across the West in various roles. He is currently the Rio Chama CFLRP team leader based on the Santa Fe National Forest. Bob worked for the National Park Service for 21 years as Chief Scientist and Chief of Science and Resource Stewardship. He established a premier research and restoration program in partnership with 40 federal, state, academic, and nonprofit organizations. Although he hung up his professional hat, he hasn't been able to stay away and still volunteers for the Valle Caldera National Preserve. Steve is a GIS specialist and data manager with 16 years of professional experience. He has worked alongside and served all types of GIS users and clients, from interns and field techs to scientists and academics, including building databases and data collection systems for Yosemite National Park and modeling wildfire risk for the U.S. Forest Service. He now works for the Forest Service on the Rio Chama CFLRP. And finally, Gabe is a member and close affiliate of the Forest Stewards Guild and worked with the organization as a program manager in the final years of the Southwest Jemez CFLRP from 2019 to 2025. Gabe has a strong interest in the human dimensions of natural resource management and wants to develop forest and fire management that strengthens the connection between rural communities and the forest lands that surround them. In his work with the Forest Stewards Guild, Gabe led the Socio-Economic Monitoring for the Southwest Jemez, Zuni Mountains, and Rio Chama CFLRPs. We are so excited to have everyone with us today, and without further ado, I will turn it over to them.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And I will share a screen here to get the PowerPoint started. And I said this takes a minute for everything to come up. But welcome everybody. It's going to be hopefully a fun, entertaining presentation today to cover all the aspects of the Southwest Jemez CFLRP program. Okay, it's working on it. Don't panic. This takes a while. All right, here we go. And are we good? Can everybody see the first slide?
Looks good, Bob.
Excellent, excellent. Very good. So the presentation today is going to cover these 8 topics. It's going to start with a quick background on CFLRP for those who might not be familiar with it. And then we're going to introduce the Southwest Jemez CFLRP project. And then we're going to switch over to a summary of the implementation accomplishments that Jeremy Marshall will talk about. And then I will talk about the monitoring results for the 15 years of the project. Stephen will kick in with the fire risk results from his modeling efforts. And then Jeremy will provide us with some examples of real fire impacts on these restoration treatments. And then Gabe will follow up with the socioeconomic impacts. And then we'll summarize things with the outcomes and the lessons learned on all of this. So the CFLRP network is nationwide. It's funded through Congress to the Forest Service, and it involves all of these sites you see on the map. And the Southwest Jemez is down here in northern New Mexico. Funded in 2009 by Congress, a bipartisan support bill of the Forest Landscape Restoration Act. It covers these basic aspects. First of all, it's going to try to improve the resilience of ecosystems to recover from disturbance events, including fires. And we're supposed to be putting these sites that we restore back on a successional trajectory to become old growth stands again, reduce the risk of uncharacteristic wildfire, and maintain or reestablish natural fire regimes. We're also supposed to improve fish and wildlife habitat, particularly with respect to T&E species, but other species as well. We're going to maintain or improve water quality in streams and rivers and watershed functioning. And then we're supposed to deal with invasive species, mostly invasive weeds, and then improve the socioeconomic regimes of the regional areas using small diameter logs for forest products. This is a satellite view of New Mexico, and our site is in the Jemez Mountains, a bit northwest of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And the mountains here is essentially a volcanic field created as a supervolcano over 1 million years ago, and the geologic formation of the Valles Caldera in the center of it. It's a series of volcanic peaks and forests and grasslands, but it has a number of different groups managing the mountain range, mostly the Santa Fe National Forest, but also the Valles Caldera National Preserve at the headwaters of the Jemez River. Project area is basically the southwestern part of the Jemez Mountains. This is what the terrain actually looks like, a series of volcanic peaks that are forested with mixed conifer forest grading down through ponderosa pine and then into pinyon juniper woodland at the lower elevations. The project area is 210,000 acres, mostly of the Santa Fe National Forest in the southwest corner, and then the Valles Caldera National Preserve in the northeast corner of the project area. Back in 2009, when our teams were putting together the analysis for fire risk in our forests, we found that most of the landscape was really at high risk of canopy fire and long flame lengths. And as a result, we were funded by the Blue Ribbon Panel from the Forest Service for 10 years of restoration funding, plus an additional 5 years of monitoring. The southwestern portion of the area, of course, is the Santa Fe National Forest. The northeastern portion was Valles Caldera, which was part of the National Forest System when the project started in 2010. However, the Congress moved the Valles Caldera to the National Park Service in 2015. So from 2016 on, the National Park Service provided funding so that we could keep going as full partners in the CFLRP. The first thing we did was set up our collaborative as we were building the proposal. This is consisting of 40 different organizations of agencies and non-government organizations and universities. This group has worked together for the last 15 years. And one of the main activities that we did would have an annual all hands meeting. This is the agenda from 2019, where we would go over all the projects we'd completed in the previous year and present the data on the monitoring programs so that everybody could see how things were going. And then we'd have a second day of planning for projects in the coming year. So it was very successful. Communication was incredibly important, but it kept everyone engaged and working. Part of the operations for this were essentially dictated by the congressional legislation. You can see them listed here. The first 4 of these are dealing with forest thinning and fuels management, as well as fires and whatnot. In addition, for watershed health and functioning, we did a lot of stream and wetland restoration. We were dictated to basically close roads where we didn't need to use them anymore. And we had a lot of old fence on the Valles Caldera that we weren't using for livestock operations anymore, so we were going to take those out. And then, of course, invasive weed control. Wanted to kind of show some pictures of what this looks like on the ground. And first of all, a lot of the areas in the Jemez Mountains had been clear cut or otherwise logged in the 20th century. So it came back as second growth doghair thickets of pine and fir. So we had really dense forests that we had to get into. And 2 approaches to this was mechanical thinning and hand crews. And on the flatter ground, we would send in the heavy equipment. They would cut out the small diameter logs, take them down to the Walatoa Timber Industries mill in the Pueblo of Jemez, and these products would then be created down there and sold in commercial venues. Following the mechanical thinning, and also the hand crews for that matter, we do broadcast burns through the area to burn off the last of the slash and open up the soil for colonization by herbaceous grasses and forbs. Hand crews would come in on the steeper terrain and rockier ground where the equipment couldn't go, and they would either do lop and scatter or cut and pile and create piles like this that we would burn later in the winter. In addition to the forest work, we had a lot of watershed work going on. There was heavy grazing in the whole Jemez Mountains area during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and they really hammered the streams. As you can see here, the grass is eaten down to the ground, and bad width to depth ratios on streams. So it was really in terrible shape. But through a lot of activities of restoration, we managed to get a lot of these streams back to what they were supposed to be looking like. Some of this was just simply remove a lot of the heavy grazing, but also active interventions was building structures in the streams, such as plug-in ponds and crossfades and a whole variety of things. There's 30 different structures that our volunteers and collaborating partners, which got outside funding to do this part, were very successful in handling a lot of the stream problems along the way. In addition, we wanted to put back a lot of the willow stands that had been taken out by livestock and various other factors over the years. And so replanting willows and other woody plants, narrowleaf cottonwoods and whatnot, turned out to be a good move to reduce water temperatures and stabilize stream banks. In addition, some of our partner organizations like Rio Grande Return would come in and put in beaver dam analogs or post-assisted log structures. This would act as little miniature check dams, but also provide habitat for beavers to be reintroduced into the project area. Finally, we had road closures and reclamation of these roads along the way. There were lots of roads that we ended up closing and restored to natural conditions here. Up on Valles Caldera, we had a lot of old fences. Again, I mentioned them earlier. These are murder on wildlife. A lot of animals would get caught here, mostly elk, but as you can see in the upper right, there's a black bear with one of our radio collars on it that actually got tangled up and died in a barbed wire fence. So we wanted to get rid of these things. And then finally, working on getting out the invasive weeds that would invariably come up in disturbed areas and some burned areas. So that was basically the types of things we wanted to do. Now Jeremy will talk about exactly what we accomplished during our 15 years. Jeremy, it's all yours.
Okay, great. This should be called What We Got Done. Jeremy Marshall, once again. Here's a great picture of the Valles Caldera from Redondo Peak, which Bob took. Next slide. This is what we got done at forest thinning, 22,000 acres, 22.5 out of 210,000 acres across the landscape. Some pre and post photos there, for example. Next slide. The Jemez Mountains, thankfully, both EISs, environmental impact statements of both the Caldera and the Forest Service, the purpose and need was cultural site protection. So we did thin around almost 3,000 cultural resource sites using hand crews, and there's a pre and post photo there. So we basically wanted to make them resilient to future disturbances, namely fire. Next slide. We got 30,000 acres done of prescribed fire and managed fire. One of the most notable ones was the Pinot Fire of 2013, which was the Southwest Fire Consortium's Incident of the Year, since we involved the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab for arc burn as well as entrapment studies. So we did a lot of managed fire using lightning strikes for benefit as well as regular RX. Next slide. Okay, this is some of the wetland stuff we've done here. We did almost more than 1,000 sites using 30 different structure types. So you can see the picture tells the story of Armeo Creek before and after. Next slide. Okay, also, as Bob mentioned before, we did more than 100 BDAs, beaver dam analogs here, and pole-assisted log structures. This is before and after San Antonio Creek, which is the priority watershed for the Santa Fe as well as the Caldera. So we worked across boundaries here. Looks great pre and post photo. Next slide, Bob. We closed 98 miles of roads in the Jemez Mountains after we got in and did the restoration treatments. Some of them are hiking trails and other things as mentioned in the slide. Next slide, Bob. We did a lot of, well, mostly the Caldera did a lot of life or fence removal across there. As it was mentioned before, and the photo alluded to, it was the Baca Ranch, which was a private ranch, which did sheep and cattle grazing. So Dr. Bob and his crew did a lot of fence removal on the Caldera, 77 miles. Next slide. And the weed invasive control, we did more than 500 acres of noxious weed control across the landscape. With all the various restoration treatments, it's certainly an issue with that. And so we got 500 acres done using a whole bunch of volunteers and various groups. And next slide. I think it's back to Bob.
Great. So as part of the CFLRP, Congress demanded, basically put into the legislation, that we will do monitoring on a variety of topics. And for the Southwest Jemez, we focused mostly on vegetation and fuels and wildlife populations. But we also had to cover the climate part with a series of ROS stations, as well as soil biota, stream water quality, and economic activities here. So the salient results of all of this are in our final report, 418 pages of it. I don't expect anybody to read this cover to cover, but if you're interested in a particular part of it, you can go into this report, which is online, and there'll be a Forest Service online site here developed shortly. And you can go to the chapter that might be of your interest, whether it's fuels, blackberry ecology, bugs, water quality, etc. You can find that chapter and get all the gory details and the data from these monitoring studies. Salient one-sentence captions of what the results were. From our ROS network across the region, we found that our whole CFLRP program occurred during periods where there were warmer temperatures than average over the last century and below average annual precipitation. So it was during a drought and during a hot drought. So that had some influence on as we were planning the different projects. Results for vegetation, we had dozens of sites that our crews went out to record a variety of variables on both woody stand characteristics as well as fuels and the herbaceous plants that were coming in the understory following our restoration treatments. And I put up two graphs here as examples. The left-hand graph looks at average tree density at one of our sites, the East Forest Project on the Santa Fe, showing that, yes, from between 2018 and 2019, we reduced the stand density from over 500 trees per acre down to 150, and it stayed that way through time. So that's a good thing. On the right-hand side, you can see herbaceous cover on another one of the sites, the North Pelado project, and this shows there's variability from year to year. But the 2022 Pelado fire, which was actually a managed wildfire, after that allowed the establishment of grasses and forbs, and we had a ground cover pop up to almost 90%. So this is the typical response that we would get at many of our sites is once we thinned it out and opened the canopy up, we got a good cover of grass and wildflowers in there.
Hey, Bob, really quickly.
Yes.
Down at the bottom of your screen, you might see a block where it says app.zoom.us is sharing your screen. Can you just hit hide? Thank you.
Sure. You bet. I thought that was only for me. My mistake. So for wildlife studies, we were very interested in all the different species that were occurring on our sites, but the large mammals were foremost because, of course, they're the charismatic megafauna of the Jemez Mountains. And so we ended up working with Jimmy Kane at New Mexico State University, and he put GPS satellite radio collars on all of these species, and we could follow them around, and he could then do analyses on resource use factors and how they responded to these restoration treatments. And the kind of summary results here is for elk. They really liked the thinning and burn sites because, of course, we would get grass coming back in to these areas, so they use those areas in a preferred fashion. Mule deer also like those sites, but after 5 years. There's a time lag for the woody browse to recover. And then, of course, they really like wildfire burned areas in springtime because that's when grasses and forbs were getting going. Black bears tend to like the more structurally complex habitats. They avoided the thinned areas initially, but they did go after areas that had prescribed fire sites, mostly because we were getting a lot of insect work and there were logs and whatnot in those areas for them to forage with. Mountain lions pretty much followed the elk and the deer wherever they went. And so in areas where the elk were common and the deer were common, the mountain lions would focus on those spots. But their day beds and den sites were mostly up on steeper slopes in rocky areas where they had good cover and concealment for the dens for their offspring. We also looked at small mammals across the burned areas and unburned areas, and we found that, yeah, tree-dwelling species like squirrels and even the understory, things like chipmunks, did not do well in high-severity fire areas. So basically trying to restore these forests to prevent them from going into wildfire conditions were beneficial to these things. However, in burned areas and restored areas, golden mantle ground squirrel populations increased. But deer mice were the most common things around, and they were everywhere. They didn't seem to care one way or the other. So there was plenty of prey available for Mexican spotted owls and other predatory animals. Our good friends with Hawks Aloft were monitoring our birds on the sites, 120 sites across the project area, and 4 breeding bird transects, 13 years of data, and 141 species of birds. And what they found was basically species richness was responding very well to treated forests, higher species richness in treated forests than untreated. Of the 15 species that were really common, that were species of concern for the state, half of them increased in abundance after treatment. The other half, they went down a little bit, but none of the species were extirpated. And 6 species of concern increased following prescribed fires. The take-home message here is a mosaic of forest treatments across the landscape is the way to maximize bird diversity. We also were looking at T&E species, in particular the spotted owl, the Jemez Mountain salamander, and the New Mexico meadow jumping mouse. These activities for the CFLRP we would undertake during times when these species were not active. So we had minimal effect on their activity patterns, and by preventing stand replacement wildfires, we presumably improved their chances of survival out here. The other 2 species, the Mexican wolf and the monarch butterfly, don't have established populations in the project area, but we continue to monitor for them in the future. My mantra on all this is bugs run the world. Insects are dominant. Invertebrates in particular are the main things that keep ecosystems functioning. So we spent a good bit of effort working on those. Overall, we've identified 1,700 species plus on these treatment areas. And we've worked on beetles and ants and grasshoppers and spiders, millipedes, centipedes, just all kinds of different invertebrates here. And what we see is as the forest treatments go in and the forest ground canopy shifts from litter to herbaceous plants, we see a shift to meadow dwelling species. And but there's still a lot of overlap there because these species can survive in a variety of habitats. This graphic here, you can get into our report, and it has lots of tables like this. The B's stand for burned favorites, and U are unburned favorites. So species have different preferences here. We also had a Douglas fir beetle outbreak following the 2013 Thompson Ridge fire. And that, of course, killed a lot of our old growth Douglas firs. So wildfire had these secondary effects of spawning these bark beetle outbreaks. We also looked at aquatic systems in the fish populations across the project area, as well as aquatic invertebrates in these streams. And so we used electroshocking techniques, triple pass methods, and whatnot. And we thought that we would show, the watersheds were doing fine with restoration treatments, but it turns out that the stand replacing fires that we had in the area during our project were the ones that really drove the fish dynamics. And here's a repeat photo of the same area during one of the post-fire floods and following the Las Conchas fire in 2011. And the graphic at the bottom shows the black line are the is the brown trout, and these are predators. They come along, and when the fire finally hits and we get these floods, they drop to zero, and then they take about 5-6 years to come back up to some of the pre-fire levels here. But then as soon as the predators are gone, you see this ecological system of predator release for the non-game native fish, the dace and the chub and the sucker in here. They all tend to go up following the removal of the brown trout. But as they come back in, those fish populations come down. So it turns out that, yes, post-fire floods have a beneficial effect for the non-game fish, and the trout have about a 5 to 6 year recovery period. Looked at stream water quality as well, using zones in the various streams in the project area. And again, fire had the biggest impact here. Here's an example from turbidity from the Rio San Antonio, and it took about 5 years following the post-fire floods for the stream to finally recover to the point that it didn't have these massive runoff events from thunderstorms bringing in ash and soil into the streams. And finally, our group, our friends at Northern Arizona University, were working on soil biota, and they looked at the compaction of impacts of mechanized equipment, feller bunchers and skidders, and found that basically a lot of the invertebrates were resilient to this sort of disturbance and compaction. They also looked at forest thinning and prescribed fires, and minimal effects on this, except for they saw reductions in the soil mite communities there. So variable responses by the different groups, but none of them were extirpated compared to high severity wildfires that sterilize the soil and essentially wipe out the soil biota, including bacteria and fungi. The last part that we looked at was fire behavior through modeling, and Steve Del Favero will give you the results on the modeling efforts here.
All right. Yeah, so I was actually involved in this project until just a few months before the final 15 report was due. I actually worked for the Rio Chama CFLRP, which as you can see in the map on the right, is adjacent to the Southwest Jemez. The Rio Chama is about 4 million acres, and that began in 2022. And I agreed to do this for the Southwest Jemez, in part to verify the methods that we chose for monitoring fuels treatment effectiveness in our monitoring plan for the Rio Chama. So we were running these same models and using the same data. And I wanted to know, could land fire data adequately detect the vegetation changes of treatments, and would this be demonstrated as wildfire risk reduction in a fire behavior model? Go to the next slide. So for this analysis, I compared FLAM map fire behavior models using pre and post project conditions. Required inputs are the terrain data, elevation, slope, and aspect, along with a fuel model data set and 4 different canopy metrics. And I ran it all with the 97th percentile extreme weather conditions taken from the nearest RAWS station. So the weather data and the terrain variables all remained constant, while the fuel model and canopy metrics varied between the model runs. And for the results, we used 2 of the fire behavior model outputs, predicted crown fire and flame length. Next slide, please. And I did 2 comparisons using 2 different sources of canopy data. One comparison using land fire, and another comparison using canopy models derived from combined LiDAR and forest ground plots. So in all, 4 model runs, and land fire was the source of the fuel model data in everything. Next slide, please. So yeah, here are the 4 different canopy metrics and the definitions of all that, and the fuel models known as FM40. Canopy metrics are pretty straightforward and standard. Fuel model is a little harder to understand, but they're basically category of fire behavior based on vegetation characteristics, including the understory. And there are 40 different categories and 4 subtypes: grass, shrub, slash, and timber. Next slide, please. One source of the canopy and fuel model data sets used for modeling was Landfire. Landfire is an extensive suite of data derived from satellite and aerial imagery and trained with various ground collected data like common stand exams and the forest inventory analysis plots. It's also updated with disturbance data such as wildfire and fuel treatments. It's free and readily available at a national level starting in 2001. But then from 2008 to 2022, it's available every other year. And then since 2022, it's now being updated annually. So you can download all the recent years pretty easily, and then you have to request the archive data. But as you can see at the bottom there, the availability of data, I was able to acquire and utilize the 2010 and 2023 data sets of Landfire. Next slide. So then the other canopy data source was from random forest models trained with LiDAR and ground plot data. And Benjamin Bright at the Rocky Mountain Research Station processed all the LiDAR data and provided these canopy models. And you can see that the 3 canopy metrics come from the random forest models, the canopy base height, canopy bulk density, and canopy height. And canopy cover comes directly as a derivative from the LiDAR. And then, so data was collected in 2010 and 2012 separately, but was able to mosaic them together to use for the pre-project conditions. And there was quite a bit of disturbance between 2010 and 2012, including the lost conscious fire. But luckily, most of this disturbance actually occurred in the area that was captured in 2010. So the 2010-2012 mosaic actually worked quite well to capture the pre-project conditions. And then in 2024, the whole area was acquired. Next slide, please. So after the fire models were run, I summarized and compared the results in 4 different analysis areas. 1, the entire CFLRP project area. 2, burned areas, which here are defined as full suppression fires, forested areas, excluding full suppression fires, and 4, treated areas. And this included managed fires, but excluded any area burned in a full suppression fire. So doing this, that allowed me to measure fire risk reduction for the entirety of the landscape and also to isolate forested areas and the impacts of treatments and fire and take all that and look at all that separately. And then moving on to the results for this, you can go back to the last slide, the map there. So that shows the actual difference visually in predicted crown fire pre and post project. And it's very clear there was a visible reduction in passive crown fire. So a lot more yellow and less orange on the right in 2024. Next slide. And then here's crown fire in a graphical form. So combined active and passive crown fire in 3 of the analysis areas. The red bars are pre-project and green bars are post-project. And you can see the reduction in all of 3 of these analysis areas. And most notable is that there was a 50% reduction in both burned areas and treated areas, where, of course, in the burned areas, entire portions of forest was lost in high severity fire versus treated areas where entire forest remains intact. Next slide, please. And then moving on to flame length, here are the maps showing pre and post project. And again, it's pretty clearly visible the reduction in high to extreme flame lengths, which are the orange and red, and then a shift to the lower flame lengths of yellow and green in the right map there. And then again, in a graphical form here, you can see the shift to lower flame lengths, both in the entire project on the top and in the treated areas on the bottom. And if you combine the extreme flame lengths, which is over 11 feet, it comes out to about 56% reduction in extreme flame lengths in the entire CFLRP and a 72% reduction where fuel treatments occurred. Next slide. So I'm not going to get into the details here about the results from the LiDAR. The models run using the LiDAR data, but in summary, it showed an overall lower fire risk, but it still very much trended towards reduced fire risk and corroborated everything that came from land fire. So I guess, yeah, in summary, this analysis definitely demonstrated that vegetation changes from treatments and fire can be detected via multiple remote sensing data sources, including land fire, and it allows for a clear demonstration in wildfire risk reduction as seen in fire behavior models. And that's the end of my section.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Just want to talk about a success story with the couple of fires here. I was the agency administrator, so it was full circle for me in 2022. If you watched the news that year, we had massive fires going on the Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon, extreme conditions. As Bob alluded to before, we had the Los Conchas fire in 2011, which burned at the time 44,000 acres at night during a burn period. So, you know, the whole Jemez Mountains certainly burns very hot. When I first heard about this fire, I thought, oh, this is the worst case scenario. It's just south of the community of 200 people in the Cerro de los Indios. But thankfully, due to the treatments we did, it protected the community and the fire did lay down, as well as the Cajete fire in 2017, which also interacted with previous treatments and which moderated the fire behavior. Next slide. Okay, so here's the Cerro Pelado 2022 fire treatment effectiveness example. If you look at the picture here, the direction of fire spread is going from from right to left, and you can see there's a little bit more live crown in the trees there. So the next couple of slides will show some of the mortality we had. The first 1,000 acres was high intensity, like 50-mile-an-hour winds, like worst case scenario. Next slide. Like here's the near the fire origin. It was actually in the treatment area, the stewardship contract treatment area. It consumed the log decks. Just was really just shows the extreme conditions, but there still is some live crown in here. The overall fire, but the first 1,000 acres was really intense, but the rest of it was pretty moderate when we did our various bark map and things like that, as in comparison to Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon, which didn't have as many treatments in that area. But due to all our various treatments we've alluded to in the past, the interactions were fairly positive. Next slide. Here's just a low intensity fire example, mosaic in here. Next slide. And here's the Cajete fire example. It hit areas that we'd thinned and burned in the past and really moderated it. It was, I believe, a fire in June as well during extreme conditions, much like Cerro Pelado, which was in April, but it was basically June, conditions basically. So, and yeah, just basically, this is some live fire, real life examples of our treatments. And so, yeah, just definitely these treatments work. And next slide, I think it's back to you or to Gabe.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can.
Yep.
Great. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the social and economic effects of project investments in the landscape towards outcomes related to collaboration, employment, and wood processing and utilization in the landscape. So next slide, please. So there, as mentioned before, there was strong engagement through the all hands, all lands collaborative efforts that were the collaborative meetings annually to share out monitoring results to the broader collaborative. Really strong engagement in that forum, over 100 different people every time those meetings were had. We had many people from the collaborative engaged to share out the results from the monitoring that Bob and others have mentioned today annually. So that was a really strong engagement opportunity. for collaboration related to the project. There was a lot of engagement with tribal partners through this project, specifically Jemez Pueblo, from the outset of the project proposal and continuing through the project in terms of wood processing and other outcomes related to the project. In kind of evaluating the socioeconomic effects of this project, we use a model called the Treatment Restoration Effects Analysis Tool. It's TREAT, to estimate, based on the number of dollars that the federal government invests, what does that kind of estimate out towards, model out towards in terms of employment and kind of the labor hours worked, basically the wages from that investment. And from that, we see that around $51 million in wages was injected into the rural economies surrounding the Southwest Jemez Mountain landscape from the initial investments of the USDA. And some of that is leverage from the Park Service. Of course, when this project started, Valles Caldera was part of the USDA, and then during the project became part of the National Park Service. And so a lot of the funding from the Park Service was able to be tracked as leverage funding towards the goals of this project, towards wood processing and employment. So that was a really strong kind of way that this project supported kind of that additional employment in the landscape. Again, I want to mention the kind of the partnership between Jemez Pueblo and and Terry Conley, Conley Enterprises for the Walatoa sawmill. So that's a sawmill in the project landscape that, again, is a joint venture between Conley Enterprises and Southwest and the Jemez Pueblo. And that sawmill was very important to processing a lot of wood that was coming off of this project, a lot of the small diameter wood, helping us achieve that goal of the CFLRP to kind of work with some of that small diameter material and create value-added products. And so here, when you see 206,000 tons of biomass were converted into value-added products by Walatoa Timber Industries. And again, that's going to have a ripple effect in terms of kind of the money going back into that local community from employment in the mill and kind of dollars being spent in the local gas stations, grocery stores from the full-time jobs that mill supported. And then again, it's not just about kind of the abstract figure of number of jobs, but the type of jobs that this project supported is really important as well. There's a lot of youth employment and lots of kind of engagement with academic institutions that we saw throughout this project that really support a quality of employment that the model doesn't capture, but we know about through interviews with a lot of our contractors that were supported through this project. Next slide, please. So here are just some different graphical representations and kind of figures to show what we learned from the model and also from interviews with folks from Walatoa Timber Industries. Every year, we spoke with Terry Conley, who runs Walatoa Mill, about the number of people that were employed at the mill and just kind of their fluctuations in the type of products that they're creating from that value-added piece. In 2016, Walatoa Timber Industries invested in a pellet mill, which supported, again, a lot of utilization of that small diameter material, continued to provide employments. As you can see in that first graph, we're seeing employment kind of steadily increase from 2013 into the kind of later years of the project. And they're actually still cutting on the stewardship acres today and still supporting this level of employment, even though the project's funding has sunset. They are kind of able to continue to support that employment. Next slide, please. And I just want to speak to, if you could click it again, Rachel, I think there's maybe an effect on this one. Again, I want to speak to just not the number of jobs, but also kind of the quality of jobs that this supported. There was a lot of youth employment throughout the landscape, a lot of positions working with, through the contracts that Valles Caldera administered with Dr. Bob that we're talking about earlier. There was a lot of employment in academic institutions that this project supported. Here you see the student appointments that this supported. Those full-time jobs for graduate students and for people who are kind of working on their undergrad in this landscape are, very valuable beyond just kind of that dollar figure of wages paid, but they provide kind of a platform for people to kind of start their careers. So there was a lot of that kind of investment in this landscape. We saw businesses really get a foothold. Dr. Bob mentioned Rio Grande Return and the Beaver Dam analogs that they put in the San Antonio Creek area. Rio Grande Return really has started to work in the Rio Chama landscape as well, and other areas in New Mexico. And so that business really started up during the Southwest Jemez project. And so we see a lot of that kind of investment where, you know, businesses get started or young people get a foothold in their career, and that kind of helps to continue forward. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is go for it. We're just going to wrap it up here. We basically graded ourselves on the outcomes of the restoration goals, and just to see where we landed. We did really well in number one, as mentioned before. Next slide. As well as number two, we can speak to the fuels reduction. The fish and wildlife habitat was impacted by the two fires that we had. Actually, 3 fires we had in the landscape, large fires. Number 4. Done really well was maintain and improve water quality. And number 5, we will rate ourselves, a C. Had still some issues with the exotic species, which is always ever present when you're doing restoration work. And last one, did really well on positive impacts, as Gabe alluded to. Next slide. All righty, so this is the last slide of the presentation. This was the first cohort of CFLRPs, the ones that were awarded in 2010. So lots of public and stakeholder support and proposal, implementation, and monitoring. Really great collaborative group. Really great science-informed planning process. The biggest thing is we had no lawsuits during this time. So we did lots of work in a litigious environment, and we got the work done, by doing the collaborative work up front and having stakeholder support. So, and that's it. Next slide.
All righty, thank you so much for a really full presentation. We covered a lot of ground in a little bit of time. So thank you so much for, all of you for putting this information together and for coming online to talk about it today. So if anyone has questions for the presenters, go ahead and put them in the chat. I will go ahead and kick it off with one quick question. At the very beginning, we mentioned the observed drought and climate warming impacts. Just wondering how those may have impacted the results of your restoration activities and the prevalence of fire in the project area, as the first part of the question. And then, knowing that we'll continue to see this trend of drying and hotter weather, what recommendations would you make to other managers who are looking at implementing the same type of work?
I'll let Bob start off with that one.
Oh, Bob, you're muted. And you can stop sharing. Yep.
All right.
Okay,
so the basic issue was that things were very hot and dry, and that led to, in 2011, right at the beginning of our project, we had the Las Conchas fire, which burned up 1/3 of the preserve in mixed severity, high severity, medium severity. And that, of course, you kind of wish Congress had put this in place 10 years earlier, and it might have been a different outcome. But so the frequency of really high severity fires was peaking during our CFLRP program. The precipitation also created an issue because we went into fire restrictions early in the summer, which delayed a lot of actual projects getting going during the year. So that was another factor. But it's basically the fire risk and the actual fires that we had that created some problems. The other aspect was that our cycles of precipitation in New Mexico, northern New Mexico anyway, seem to follow about a 50 to 60 year cycle of 25 to 30 years of above average rainfall and about 25 to 30 years of below average. And we're in the below average part now, but we should be coming out of it. So in the next 5 to 10 years, things should get back up to normal. Wild card is climate warming here, but as it gets back to normal, we'll probably have 20 to 30 years of normal precipitation or above average precipitation. And this will be the time to really finish wrapping up a lot of restoration efforts in the Southwest while we've got reasonably good precipitation. So before the next drought starts around 2050, because it'll be really hot then, and we'll have another big deficit of moisture. So it'll be troublesome in 30 years.
And I would add to that too, just be aggressive when you can. We have certain years where the forest is closed, and the next year we get precip, be out there managing forest for resource benefit, be aggressive when the conditions present themselves as a manager, because it's just so variable these days. So I think we need to play offense when we can. And so there's other examples of that with the Midnight Fire and the Carson and things like that, where, just use those opportunities. So
that's for sure. And one last thing on this is the one thing that has probably stopped us in prescribed fire the most often was smoke restrictions. So that, again, in the Southwest, prehistorically, fires burned all the time, low severity fires, punking along for weeks and months in the understory. And there was smoke in the air all summer long. And so the issue today is, we're stopped by requirements for mitigating the smoke impacts, and that slows everything down. It allows the fuels to build up. So if at some point we can, change the rules about smoke in the air, then we can really make some progress on getting prescribed and planned fires going.
Yeah, thank you for that good answer. So Lindsay asked, now that the 15 years have concluded, just curious on any reflections on what might be next. So for example, how might results from monitoring apply in different ways? How might partnerships continue, etc.?
Well, yeah, Jeremy, you want to talk for the Santa Fe?
Yeah, I think with the Santa Fe, I think one of the biggest things we've learned a lot from this project for Ria Chama. We changed kind of how we set up that project. We learned a lot on terms of stewardship contracts and some of those issues. We kind of created more of a decentralized project because we saw that there were some issues with that. As far as the monitoring, I think it just speaks to, that these treatments work. So that's really good. But I think as far as the Santa Fe, those are just the general take-homes. I wasn't involved in a proposal. I got here in 2012, but, I certainly learned a lot on how to run a landscape project, at least, take two for me. So.
There you go. Yeah, and at Valles Caldera, under CFLRP, we are almost done with forest thinning. We've focused on the forests that didn't burn in Las Conchas and Thompson Ridge, and we've really just about finished those. There's a few left to go, a few stands, but they're going to be taken care of in the next few years. The main future change is going to be with our new fire management plan that is just going through its EIA, its environmental assessment now. And essentially the big philosophical change is to take advantage of managed fires, naturally started fires by lightning, and let them burn in the summer and let them keep going. And we've got the forest structure in a condition that these natural fires should be able to punk right through at low severity. And that's what we need to do to maintain the landscape.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up, Bob, just talking about maintenance and how do we do maintenance in a way that's not as, cost competitive. Alrighty, so we probably have time for one last question. I was just thinking about how, we had multiple high severity fires that burned through the project area, and in 2022, we saw that recurrent fire in a previously burned area can and will burn a lot hotter and faster than we previously thought. So just wondering if you have any metrics for how the work done in this CFLRP may have reduced how repeat fires will burn in burn stars.
Jeremy or Steve?
Steve, yeah. I will speak though, the Cerro Pelado fire did burn into the Los Conchas burn scar, and actually was consuming the heavies and stuff, and kind of shocked us a little bit. It was only, 13 years before. So when I was agency administrator, and yeah, it was going towards Los Alamos, which was obviously not a pleasant experience as the responsible official. So, but yeah, I think, we only get a few years really after some of these fires, and then things come back pretty, the regrowth was pretty high in there. So it surprised all of us and the fire staffs. So
yeah, we had one fire on the preserve on a place called Banco Benito called the Big Hat Fire, and it was a lightning strike that hit in the middle of one of our thinned out forested areas, and it behaved beautifully. It just stayed on the ground. The fire crews put a ring around it of several hundred acres, and we just let it burn. So these things do work. These things do work.
All right, so we're just about at the top of the hour. So for anyone who needs to hop off, just want to say thank you for being online today. I know that our presenters were able to stand for just another couple of minutes, so we'll finish up with this last question from Lucy, asking, have you been able to monitor the improved growth in the trees that remain by looking at rings or other metrics?
We're certainly able to do that. We haven't as yet. It's still kind of young. We can see that from other studies that yes, as soon as you open up the canopy, reduce the competition between trees for water, nutrients, and sunlight, that yes, the rings start to get bigger. So I think that's what we would certainly expect to see, but we haven't done that as yet. But we have Dr. Tom Swetnam living in Jemez Springs. So he was the director of the tree ring lab. So I'm sure we can twist his arm to come out and take a few ring samples for us by coring some trees.
Yeah, and Tom's on the call today, so I guess you're hearing the request now.
That's right. That's right. We'll come call him, Tom.
All righty. So I want to just take a minute again to thank you so much, Bob.
What? They ask questions of you.
Hey, can you see me? Let me turn the video on. Hello.
There you are. There you are. Okay, Tom.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, got a question?
No, we were just, Lucy had asked if we've been able to monitor improved growth in trees, following treatments by looking at tree rings. We were just saying that we'll get in touch with you later to come out and take a few cookies.
Yeah, that would be very, very cool thing to do to see what kind of response. I would expect there's a growth response. I mean, we've seen this in other cases where thinning work has been done and the residual trees show a clear growth surge. In fact, I mean, it's been used in tree ring studies before as to use growth surges to document times when fire or other disturbances in the past opened up the stand, because you can see a growth response. So yeah, and and there's some published work showing that increased vigor of trees in thinned areas are likely more resistant to bark beetle attack. You're basically improving the flow, the sap resin flow, and so that's a primary mechanism of resistance.
Yeah, it'll all be good to look at in the future. And like Julie mentioned, LiDAR could also be a good tool for monitoring improved growth as far as tree height changes for decades into the future. So, All right. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you so much to Bob and Jeremy, especially, and to Steve and Gabe, who is joining us from overseas today. Thanks for taking the time for putting together this really excellent report and for coming online today to share it with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. As a closing remark, I'll just say that this work represents a wealth of knowledge and improvements made over the 15-year lifespan of an early adoptee of the CFLRP model. However, CFLR implementation elsewhere is still ongoing, as you saw with the Rio Chama CFLRP and other projects across the nation. And there are folks on the call who might be interested in continuing the conversation about lessons that can be learned and applied on other landscapes. So if you have that interest, we just invite you to reach out to your colleagues and collaborators to pursue opportunities for knowledge exchange across CFLRP projects and landscapes. And thank you again to our presenters and to everyone online today. We'll see you for the next one.
Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Rachel.